is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
You're listening to Paranormal UK Radio.
Hello, everybody. This is the Paranormal UK Radio show coming to you from the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Irene and Mark, and with me again tonight is Mark Johnson.
you know, we've only been doing this for I don't know how many years now, and you continuously forget my name.
Well, I call you the Nameless Wonder.
And T-Boy and everything else.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I've got some names for you too, but this is a family program.
I get that block. I'll tell you why I get that block, okay?
Okay.
Because I can't help it. When I turn around and look at this computer, your mugshot is all over the computer. All right? And it's that grin on your face that just does it. It does it to me every time.
That sounds kind of like a personal problem.
Can you not change it and just have the words Mark Johnson written there so that I won't forget them?
Sure, I could do that. I can take my picture down if it's throwing you off.
No, it's not throwing me off. It's a very, very nice picture.
Yeah. Yeah. Out of date when I'm back in when I was really fat.
You were never fat, Mark.
Oh, jeez, Louise.
You weren't fat. And I tell you what, that photograph you sent tonight, well. Yeah,
I've lost 45 pounds.
Yeah, you have. You have.
Yep.
Unbelievable.
Yep. Now I'm fitting in designer jeans. Who'd have thunk?
Oh, no.
Yep.
Are you?
Yep.
Oh, brilliant. You'll have to let everyone know what you're doing. You know, because people are going to be writing in now, wanting to know, how did Mark lose the weight?
A lot of hard work with a trainer who has me on a pretty strict diet and lots of exercise. So cutting out, I hate to say it, cutting out carbs is the main thing. Eating your protein, your vegetables, and exercising, but cutting down the carbs, which shame, because I love bread and pasta, but not allowed to have it.
Oh, that's my weakness as well, you know, because I don't like animals. I don't like eating animals, so it's all carbs with me, I'm afraid.
See, I'm a member of PETA, People for the Eating of Tasty Animals.
Oh, yeah. I thought you would be.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Getting off of this now before I have a row with you.
Uh-huh.
Okay. How's things been going with you?
Well, things are fine over here. We've been dealing with our hurricanes, and you've been dealing with your storms too. So this time of year is just really, really odd, the weather that we're getting.
People, if anyone hears like a squeak in the background, that is Pickles Pee-wee, the Pope Parrot. Unfortunately, I have to share a room with him tonight, so
there he goes.
Bugger.
And what is he? He's mimicking an alarm, isn't he?
I don't know. He's going to end up in the oven if he keeps on, I tell you.
Yeah, good luck trying to get a hold of him. He'll rip your face off.
Oh, I know. Yeah, talking about the weather, though, we are flooded. Carmarthen is flooded. Sadly, according to what I read, a flock of 100 sheep was swept away, which has upset me quite a bit. And I know there was 2 horses stranded on a mud bank.
That's bad.
Yeah, shut up. But I was watching the news tonight, and one fella said that it went from knee-high to 8 foot in depth in 45 minutes.
It's terrible what's happening out there. I mean, the U.S. has gotten hit with 2 major hurricanes so far this season, and hopefully we don't get any more. But it's just really the devastation this last one did, hitting the Florida Panhandle. It totally destroyed an entire town.
I know. It's awful, isn't it?
Yes.
Absolutely awful, saddening. But I don't know what's coming to the world. I really don't. You know, it's all here the weather is all out of sync, literally out of sync. We had a heat wave for weeks and weeks during the summer, and now, it's like hurricane force blasted winds out there, torrential rain, or more than a month's, well over a month's rain in so many hours.
Well,
and
we're definitely getting climate change. That's obvious. With what's causing it?
I think there's somebody with a little knob they keep twiddling.
Yeah, I think so too. That wouldn't surprise me one bit.
Yeah, there's a knob twiddler out there somewhere.
It's like, ooh, let's give hurricane force winds to the UK. Go.
Yeah, they haven't had some for a long time.
It's too damn sunny in Florida. Send in a hurricane.
Yeah.
Or like, hey, it's September in the Northeast. Let's give them frigid temperatures. Go. And then the next day we get 80 degrees. I mean, go figure.
It's strange, isn't it? You just don't know whether to put on woolly knickers or blooming a bikini.
I know. I've got my fireplace finally hit on today because it was getting so chilly out.
Yeah?
Yeah. Got a wood fire going. I love the smell of wood smoke.
Yeah, so do I, but my chimneys are blocked at the moment with birds' nests. So
start a fire and that'll get them out.
No, I'm just putting the central heating on.
Nah, get a fire going, and then put some like gasoline on it so that the flames shoot right up the chimney. That'll clear them out real quick.
So wicked, Mark
yes,
Johnson.
I am. And you know what? You could barbecue at the same time.
Oh, people write in and complain.
Yes, I'm politically incorrect and proud of it.
I know. Anyway, right, so what are we doing now? Come on then.
What are we doing now?
Let's get going. Let's get on with the show.
Let's get on with the show. Okay, well, we have our guest for this evening. We are speaking with Jeff Davis, or Jefferson Davis. Which do you prefer, Jeff or Jefferson?
Jeff Davis, I prefer, because one time this disc jockey on a radio station somewhere in the U.S. threatened to sue me for stealing his trademark name, Jeff Davis.
Jeff, that's better.
Do you know? Yeah, okay.
That's better to say Jeff, because at the moment, Jefferson's too much while you're sucking at grapes.
Yeah.
And I'm sucking grapes.
Yeah, because I was going to ask if it was Jefferson Davis. I was going to ask, so how did it feel like losing the Civil War?
Slavery is wrong. So on that issue, I'm okay with the South losing the war. The issue of states' rights, we're still arguing about right now.
Yes, well, on that we agree. Now, Jeff, you have your website, which is Ghosts, Critters, and Sacred Places of Washington and Oregon. So I was wondering if you could tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself and how you got into not only investigating the paranormal, but just a little bit about your background and experiences.
Sure. I really got an interest in the paranormal from a very young age, and it may well parallel the development of a lot of your listeners. When I was a kid, my parents, kind of in self-defense, I have ADHD, they bought me a television and said, "Here, go watch this TV." And there was a local TV station that on Friday and Saturday nights, they used to run really old horror movies. And I remember I must have only been like 10 or 11 years old, and I saw the original Boris Karloff Mummy movie for the first time. And it really entranced me, because it was scary, but it involved things like magic and history and archaeology and reincarnation, all these concepts that were really new to me as a kid. And that really did have a basis. I ended up eventually getting a master's degree in archaeology. I worked for several years as an archaeologist, and part of anthropology is the study of all aspects of human culture, and that includes the supernatural, myths, folklore. And so it just all seemed to go together.
Well, I have the same kind of passion. It's never been an archaeologist myself, but I do have a fascination with history, and I try to read up on history as much as possible, and not just the history that we're fed in school as we grow up, or as the mainstream history. I like the alternative history, the things that kind of buck the trend a bit in terms of what our real history is like, and things that may have actually happened compared to what we're being taught happened. So, but for the U.S. especially, in dealing with the history of towns and buildings and the people who lived here over the years, and going back for several hundred years, and people think about America has only been around 200 plus years, but North American continent has been here forever, and we've had people here for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years.
Yes, absolutely. And here in the Pacific Northwest, because of the availability of resources like salmon, a lot of the archaeology suggests people have been here for at least 10,000 years, and a population in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, before the European plagues came in the 1700s. And what makes a place suitable for living today, flat ground, close to water, so on, that made it ideal to live 5 or 10,000 years ago. So a lot of these towns and cities here in the Pacific Northwest are really built upon the same kind of a place as the native folk would have lived.
Well, I've got a certain affinity for the Native American peoples on this continent, and it's ironic how they were treated by the white invaders, pretty much, as I look at it, the white influx of Europeans coming through and the U.S. government. And yet so many locations around here are named after their tribes, their what they called certain locations. So we've incorporated so much of their language into our naming our locations, our cities, our towns, our whatever, all around the country. So it's rather ironic, don't you think?
Yes, but it's interesting when we, from our present day perspective, look back in the past. Some people believe or are taught that it was all about domination and hatred and things like that. If you look into and read the diaries of the day, and even some of the newspapers back in the 1800s and late 1700s, there was a lot more mixing, and I think there were a lot more instances of respect, which is why you have people naming their children. For instance, William Tecumseh Sherman was named after the Native American chief Tecumseh. So it's a lot more involved than some people think.
It's fascinating, and again, not only I love history, not only U.S. history but world history, so I can get on historical subjects at the drop of a hat. But let's talk a little bit about the paranormal. Now, you started getting interested in it after seeing things as a child. Did you ever have any of your own experiences?
Yes, I have, and I have to kind of state, I've had almost every single kind of paranormal experience people talk about, with the exception I've never seen an apparition, but I have had objects appear that weren't there before. I've had things disappear and reappear later, hot spots, cold spots, everything else the literature talks about, but still never had an actual apparition, although I probably would have if I'd yanked open a couple of doors and looked inside, I think. There was one occasion when I lived in the UK for almost a year. I went to graduate school at the University of Sheffield, and on a visit I came back and stayed in the flat of some friends. And it was it was an older flat, probably dated from the, I would say, 1870s, 1880s. And our friends were actually gone. So it was myself and my wife And one friend, he was asleep on the ground floor, and the loo was on the first floor, up the first flight of stairs.
I've been waiting for this story, Jeff.
Yeah.
Not that I'm fascinated with loos, but
Yeah. Well, and yeah, we did briefly chat about this offline, but the paranormal researchers never talk about haunted loos, do they?
No, but you see, I've got a haunted loo downstairs, and also I have problems with the bathroom, because the bathroom was where the deacon that used to own this house used to write his sermons. So,
interesting.
Yeah, I'll tell you about it one day. Carry on. Let's hear about your loo.
Okay. Now, the people who are listening that have not been to the UK and been to some of these flats, it was ceilings in England, the UK are fairly high compared to American house ceilings. America, they're about 8 feet high. UK, 10 to 12 feet high. And so,
what was it? Was it a Victorian house that was converted into flats?
I think actually it was row houses. This was in Sheffield, and so a lot of factory workers, they just had the non-detached. Everything was just one long row of attached buildings.
Terraced,
in a crescent. And so we left our friend who had a little bit too much to drink sleep on a couch on the ground floor, and there's a flight of stairs up, and then there was a landing, and there was a bedroom on that floor, but my wife and I were on the top floor in the guest bedroom, but the loo was on that landing, and so my wife went up all the way to the top to the bedroom. And so I was going to go use the loo. And one of the interesting things, and believe it or not, I've seen this in America too. There was a clothes hamper at the landing on that first upper floor, and there were our friends that put some cowbells on that. And I've had a couple of other friends who've had cowbells on their clothes hampers too. I don't know why, but what ended up happening was I went past that and went into the loo, and I was, how do you put it politely, trying to do my business, and then I heard the cowbells go clang-a-lang-a-lang, and I didn't hear anybody moving. I didn't hear my wife come downstairs, and I didn't hear our friend walking up the stairs, and so I kind of leaned over within sight of the bathroom door, and the hallway light was on, and so I saw the shadows of 2 feet under the door. And then I think I called out, "Janine, is that you?" It's my wife.
Yeah.
And the feet went away, and a couple seconds later I heard the clang-a-lang-a-lang of those cowbells on the landing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I continued trying to do what I was trying to do, but a few seconds later, clang-a-lang-a-lang. And then I looked, and there were the feet again. And I called out again, this time our friend, Christian, is that you? No answer then either. And they stayed there. And so I got up because I couldn't finish what I was trying to do. And I tried as softly as I could going to the door. And just a few feet away from the door, I saw the shadows of the feet disappear. And then a couple seconds later, clang-a-lang-a-lang. And so I went out and looked on the landing, looked in the spare bedroom. Nobody was there. I went down, checked out our friend Christian. He was still sleeping it off. Mm-hmm. And then I just went up, and my wife was asleep in bed. And I said, "You didn't come downstairs, did you?" "No." And when our friends got back, this was we were borrowing the flat from some friends who were on holiday. And I said, "Is your house haunted?" And they said, "Yes." "I didn't want to tell you just in case." And I said, "Well, yeah, I know it's haunted." And she said that they had rented the flat furnished because the previous tenant, who was in her 80s, had died in her sleep. And her son didn't want to move any of the furniture. and that they had encountered her several times, never saw her, but just felt her presence.
Oh, wow. How long ago was this?
This is some years ago, probably about 15 years ago now.
Yeah, because there was a craze over here where I noticed a lot of people had cowbells hanging in their houses.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I think a lot of people were just attracted to them. I mean, they used to hang in the pubs as well, cowbells and things like that.
And that fad made its way to the U.S. too.
Yeah, I think we need more cowbell.
I think we've moved on from cowbells out here.
I hope so. Except for certain Saturday Night Live skit.
Yeah,
more cowbell.
I was waiting to see if you picked up on that. So good job. Good job.
Oh dear. Well, yeah, like I said, I've got the haunted lure as well. You know, you go in there, you do a number 2, and in a few minutes, well, less than that, a few seconds later, beautiful smell of lavender everywhere. But it's only in the toilet. It's not outside in the hallway. Only in the toilet.
Now, see, if they had some of the real ghost-catching devices, you could market that to other householders.
Yeah. Yeah. Well.
The paranormal odor evaluator.
Yeah, the bathroom upstairs isn't quite so nice. You know, you could be sitting there just singing away on the loo and one thing or another, and all of a sudden the door will swing back with such a force as if somebody's kicked it.
Wow.
And you just have to, and sometimes I've walked in there and I felt a presence in there and I just say, out, out, out. And it just lifts and goes.
Yep. There are certain places where you do need privacy. That's definitely true.
Definitely. So, any other exciting things happen in that particular house?
No, not to the best of my knowledge. They were only renting it for a year. And I think other than just feeling the presence, and my friend said she just felt like there's curiosity. Like the ghost is saying, I could swear this is my flat. What are you doing here?
Yeah.
So I'll stop. I
wonder if ghosts ever look at us and think that we're ghosts.
Yeah, I'm kind of a subscriber to the kind of the existential theory, the relationship of the third dimension and time itself. That in some cases, what we think is a ghost or a haunting, some people believe that time is not straight and linear. That time is fluid in some ways, and that it will curve and bend in on itself like a river.
Yeah, we've talked about this often, haven't we, Mark?
Well, yeah, the idea that, you know, maybe all time is actually happening at once, something that I know Dr. Michio Kaku has discussed with string theory. And, you know, sometimes when we think that we're seeing apparitions of a past spirit, maybe what we're seeing is that ripple in time where you're actually seeing a very much alive person in their time zone anyway.
Yeah, and because we're only third dimensional beings, we imperfectly perceive time, limited by our own brains. And so that's why it may well be misty or incomplete.
As Douglas Adams once said, time is an illusion, lunchtime doubly so.
I don't get that. I don't get that.
It's British humor. You should get it.
Oh, no, I don't get it. I don't have lunchtime, so maybe that's it.
Maybe that's it.
Yeah, maybe. Okay.
Actually, Jeff, I wanted to ask you now, one of the things that's happening right now on the Travel Channel, Ghost Adventures is doing a four-part episode called Graveyard of the Pacific, and they shot a lot up there in Oregon. And now, were you involved in any of those episodes?
Yes, I was. And it's interesting, and I hope the British audience feels a tie into this, because most of the episodes were filmed in and around the city of Astoria. And Astoria started as an American fur trade post for less than a year, and then the War of 1812 happened, and the British sent a ship. I think it was the HMS Raccoon. Wonderful name for a ship. Anyway, basically the Americans sold their fur trade interest in the Pacific Northwest to a British fur trading company, and that gave essentially England what became the Hudson's Bay Company total control of the Pacific Northwest as far as a European power from the 1812 to the 1840s. So there really is a tie to British Empire period. And so I hope that the Northwest audience or the British audience is interested for that reason. The television show Ghost Adventures, I know one of their researchers fairly well, and all of these shows, with the criticism that comes from television audiences about historical accuracy, they try and do as best research as they can.
Which researcher do you know? Because I think I know both. Well, I know both Jeff Belanger and Dave Schrader.
Yep, Jeff Belanger.
Yeah, Jeff's a great guy. I've met Jeff on a few occasions. He's definitely a nut, and I even referred a couple of locations to him once for Ghost Adventures. But yeah, he's a great guy, and he really tries to. Both he and Dave Schrader really try to do a good job in getting as much of the history as possible for a location.
Exactly, and I've known Jeff for, over a decade. He wrote a book called Weird Massachusetts as part of a national book series, and I co-wrote Weird Washington and Weird Oregon. So that's how we met.
Yeah, that started here in New Jersey with Weird New Jersey with the Mark Moran and Marco, I forget his other name. Skirman, yes. The two Marks started that off with Weird New Jersey, and then they did a nationwide of all the books of different states. So very familiar with that. Yeah,
and there's actually a Weird England. And I contributed a couple stories to that.
No, does it have Irene's picture in it?
You never know. It could be a psychic picture that only
that's all that's in it. Is there's a picture of Irene. That's the book.
Yeah, it's just my eyes.
Yes.
If you want to ever write a book on weird Wales, definitely come to this house, okay? Because this is the weirdest house in Wales. I'm absolutely sure of it. In fact, I think I would class this as one of the most haunted houses in the UK.
Well, not only is the house so very haunted, but the area where the house sits over ley lines, you have you're on a UFO highway there, and you also have experiences with the British Bigfoot, the Trey Moore, the Welsh Bigfoot, I should say.
Yeah, that's if it is the Trey Moore. Yeah, I'm almost certain it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I still haven't got 100% the answer to that yet, but there is something weird that comes around. But the house itself, like I say, I don't think there is one day that goes past where something doesn't happen in this house. No, there is not one day that goes past that something doesn't happen in this house. Yeah,
but I thought you could usually blame that on Gertie or Pickles.
Yeah. Yeah, all right then. Okay.
So Jeff, how many episodes of the of Ghost Adventures do you know you're going to be in?
Well, this is the interesting thing. When they filmed 4 episodes, and I was in the background trying to find witnesses as well as helping with the historic research, and I definitely filmed spots for 2 of the 4 episodes, but when they take 20 or 30 hours of raw film footage, you never know if you're not going to end up on the cutting room floor, so to speak.
Been there, done that, got the T-shirt.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, so...
and usually it's the best evidence that ends up on the cutting room floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've heard that complaint a lot and about a lot of paranormal shows and people who they've gone to locations and they go, why didn't they show this thing? It was so great. And it's like, for whatever reason, when it gets to the producers and the channel and the network, they pick and choose what they want to show.
Yeah. In some cases, well, gosh, what you said was really, really good, but you're not so photogenic, you know?
Yeah. Well, the worst one I had is I did an episode of Haunted Highways with Jack Osborne. Do you remember that show on Sci-Fi a couple years back?
Yeah.
And they interviewed me, and Jack was nice enough, but halfway through my interview, this stupid pinhead producer interrupted me and kept trying to get me to change my story. And I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
So guess who didn't wind up in the episode?
Yeah, yes. Now I've got to say, in fairness to Ghost Adventures, fortunately that did not happen as far as changing your story. That didn't happen to me, but still, you know, they leave the location with 30 or 40 hours, 20, 30 hours, and so yeah, you never know, and who knows what exciting things happened that I did not see.
True, if you weren't there, especially for all of the investigation. And you know, that's the thing. We've talked about paranormal shows so much on our show that, and having been on a few paranormal shows, and I actually have a film and broadcasting background. So, you know, the regular public doesn't understand how long and boring paranormal investigation is. It's never as exciting as you see it on TV. And you have to remember that on TV, they could be investigating one location for 3 or 4 days, and they have to incorporate the actual investigation. Even an hour show like Ghost Adventures, I mean, the first 20, 25 minutes of the show is all set up and talking about the history. Then they show you maybe out of an hour show, it's 46 minutes of actual show. The rest is commercials. And out of that 46 minutes, 20 minutes of that is set up in history. And then there's 20 minutes of investigation out of like maybe 72 hours of filming. 23 minutes is what you see on TV.
Yes, and what I try and tell people is what the show editor and producer are trying to do is reflect the reality of the situation with all that extra footage. And sometimes a message comes out, sometimes it's not quite so clear.
No. That's TV for you. But, well, anyway, it's exciting. I've seen the first of the episodes. I have the other one taped. I have to still watch it yet. And of all the ghost shows that have been out there, Ghost Adventures is my guilty pleasure. Do I agree? Do I agree with them on most of the time? Oh, hell no. I think that they do so much wrong, but I also still think that they're, just my opinion, I still think they're one of the more legit shows out there. I mean, I think they get wrong conclusions all the time, and they focus too much on the quote-unquote demonic. But when they're playing, they have certain experiences that they're showing. The evidence, for the most part, seems legit. Even if I think half their EVPs are... they think they know what it's saying, and they don't.
They've been running a long time, haven't they? So there must be something in it.
It's like 15 years, I think.
Getting there. I mean, well, all of these shows, they did their movie back in 2006, and then their series started the next year. So they got about 12, 13 years under their belt.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
You know, and then there was Ghost Hunters that lasted like 12 seasons.
Which one was it that was Barry was in? Barry Fitzgerald.
He started off in Ghost Hunters and then went to Ghost Hunters International.
That's right. Yeah, I get them muddled up.
Yeah.
For a second there, I thought you were talking about the movie The Quiet Man, but it's a different person.
No, Barry Fitzgerald. Yeah, Barry Fitzgerald, Irish investigator. He was on Ghost Hunters International for a while, for a long time. He was also started off in regular Ghost Hunters. Really nice guy. And but yeah, I had issues with Ghost Hunters for a while there because of the producers who make that show, and I know a lot of the cast members and former cast members who are on it, so you get to hear some of the dirt, and you know how unscrupulous it was.
Yeah. Well, what I found interesting about Ghost Hunters was the first couple of years, every so often in the end of the episode, he would say, "You know what? We got Butkus here. Let's go plumb some houses." They didn't get anything, and they said so.
Yeah.
But when you get some of these shows, and I'm speaking generically, where every episode they get something, the law of averages suggests, and you had already mentioned how many hours it takes to do an investigation. I'll kind of leave it at that ambiguity to me.
Well, yeah, and I'm a little less ambiguous because, and I've said this before, I did an episode of Paranormal State several years ago, and they, how they treated our clients was abysmal, releasing personal information when they requested it not to be, faking information, totally rearranging and misrepresenting evidence that was captured, that we captured, and it was a clusterfuck, and they did things that were just very unethical, and all they cared about was the scare factor. And so was very openly critical of that show. Like I said, I don't see Ghost Adventures doing it like that. I mean, it's just my personal opinion from what I know of the industry, what I see of the show. I think they're, for the most part, up and up, even if I don't agree with their methods and what they do. Hey, not everybody's going to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I have to say this too. In the behind the scenes, I was just amazed. I don't know the bios on everybody on the show. I was just amazed at Zach, his directorial expertise. All of the exterior and setup shots. He's the one who called the shots on that. He's the one who said, no, get me this lens. No, get that lens. And he set the angles and the equipment that they used for all these establishing shots, at least on the outside, showing the locations. And he was very, very meticulous, and I respect that.
Well, he and Nick Groff started off when they did the original Ghost Adventures documentary movie, and I had a chance to talk briefly with Nick Groff after their first season started. They, how they had to really fight and negotiate to have such creative control, because most of these people's, like even ghost hunters, the TAPS team had no idea what they signed up for when they signed the dotted line in these contracts. They don't realize how they were owned by Pilgrim Films and pretty much told that, you have to do this or we'll sue you. Where with Ghost Adventures, they fought for creative control and they got it. And it took a long time to get within the right fit for them. So Zach has been working as a documentary filmmaker all this time, not just shooting a TV show, but he's also as the host and creative. Now, I know a lot of people have an issue with his personality, but at least he knows his stuff in dealing with setting up and creating a show and a documentary.
Yeah, and they were all really nice to me, even when they said, "Jeff, back up, you're standing in frame." Whoops, sorry about that.
Move your arse.
Yeah. So do you watch many of these programs, Jeff?
I do watch some, and this will sound very provincial to some of the UK audience. I live in an area that's outside of. I don't have fiber optic lines out to my house. I'd have to cut down 30 trees to get satellite dish. Yeah. So I don't have actually that capability most of the time. I have to go to somebody else's house to watch cable shows, and Travel Channel is a cable channel. So I live vicariously through some of my friends when I visit.
Well, I know these shows are very, very popular over here, but they pulled the arse off of me.
Well, considering that you live in a haunted house, so you're dealing with this every day, and it's old hat to you, and you've been dealing with this since you were 5 or 6 years old, so. Yeah. Yep.
I watch these shows and I think, no, don't do it like that, sweetie. No, you don't do it like that. You do it like this.
Or then you get most haunted, and you get you do the most haunted drinking games, and how many times you drink every time Yvette screams, or every time a rock is thrown, or
Oh, I tell you what, there was a time when it got on my nerves so much that every time she screamed, I screamed as well. I scared the shit out of my dog. You know?
see,
So
even Pickles is protesting.
Yeah, well, yeah. Carry on, Pickles, and you're going in that oven. I mean it. Anyway, so
Well, Jeff,
I showed Pickles once a frozen chicken. You know that? Put him into shock for a week.
I love it. Well, Jeff, with where you live, let's talk about some of the locations that you have investigated along the way. Now, I know part on your website you talk about these barracks.
Yes. Yeah. It's so funny. Again, harping on the whole British connection with the Pacific Northwest. In 1849, the U.S. Army arrived in what's now Vancouver, Washington, which is older than Vancouver, Canada, and set up the military barracks essentially upslope of the Hudson's Bay Company stockade and center of operations. And so this was 1849. And I know in Europe that's not a long time ago, but it is here. And my father was stationed here when he was still wearing the uniform, and I enlisted at the age of 17 in the Army Reserves. And almost 30 years later, I was still in uniform, off and on, Army Reserves and regular Army, and I was the last military tenant in one of these buildings. And so I just grew up in and around here, and kind of in tune with the history and the paranormal history too. Just talking to people who live on the row even now, and let's face it, a military barracks that's been occupied for 160 years. Being a soldier is a pretty lonely life. Being a soldier's family, children and wives, is pretty lonely too. And this area really has more than its share statistically of suicides and assaults for sometimes the smallest reasons. And fortunately, we've got a really good newspaper and historical database. So what'll happen sometimes, people, some of the old residences are rented out even now. People will come to me and say, "You'll never believe what happened to me." And I just start researching back and find, Colonel so-and-so committed suicide in this building in your bedroom, those kind of things.
You're talking about that. There was a time when my son lived on in some houses that belonged to Caterham Barracks, or had been part of the Caterham Barracks at one time. And there'd been suicides in them.
Yeah.
From soldiers.
Mm-hmm. And I am also a believer, just like we had talked about time and the fluid nature of time, that remnant spirits and tragic events leaving some kind of an energy stain on the local environment, and many places here seem to suffer from that.
Yeah. It's so sad. It really is so sad. That this happens, but it does happen, and that's it. So what about Beulah Abbey? Beulah Abbey, for people who don't know, is in the UK. Come on. Tell me about Beulah. It's such a beautiful place.
It is. And this experience happened to me, in the 1980s. And I had enlisted for 3 years of active duty in the Army at that time, and I was stationed in Italy, and I was a little tired of eating pizza.
Whereabouts in Italy?
I was in the region, the Veneto region. I lived in a barracks about 30 miles away from Venice itself. And I guess I got blasé because we must have visited Venice like 50 times.
I'm thinking of going there for Christmas, actually. He promised me last Christmas, so I'm working on him for this Christmas because I didn't get there for last Christmas, but I got friends up near Venice. But the reason I asked is because I'm in the south of Italy every year. So, and I thought you might have been down Naples way or somewhere like that. Anyway, carry on with your story about Beulah Abbey.
Okay. Well, I got tired of eating pizza. And so I said, I'm going to go somewhere where if I want to eavesdrop on people's conversations, I can do that. And I naively, I said, let me go to England for 30 days leave. And of course, an American, we don't pick up some English regional accents very well. So that was kind of a bust.
Yeah, I know that.
But I bought, they used to, it was National Railway at the time. And so it was possible to buy a British rail pass that was good for the entire country.
Yeah.
And so in about 30 days, I went from the Isle of Wight in the south all the way to the Orkney Isles, just traveling by train and then ferry and bus. And I had read a book, and this one woman, it was an American, but she lived in the UK in the 70s, and she was a famous author. And so she had been invited to stay in these various places that most Americans weren't invited. And she was a guest at Beulah Abbey. And she had written in her book, which contained a lot of ghost stories, about the timeless quality there at the Abbey. And if you've been there, and I was there too, it really does feel most of the time like a tranquil place.
Yeah.
And she had commented that she was in the main house and had opened the windows and was looking out at the what were then the remains of the Abbey, which in those days was really just an open grassy field with piles of rubble where the columns had been for their cathedral.
Yeah.
And so it was on my bucket list. So I went and visited, and this was late April or early May. And I arrived, and this was shortly after they had opened it as the Motor Museum, and the tourists had not yet started arriving.
Yeah, talking about that, Mark, your father-in-law will love that motor museum at Beulah Abbey.
Oh,
Absolutely.
I bet he would.
All old vintage motors.
Oh, yes, I bet he would. He's definitely an old 50s car guy.
Oh, no, earlier than that, some of them.
20s and 30s.
Yeah.
Yeah, plus their little tram line. Yeah. So anyway, there were not very many people around. As a matter of fact, I more or less had the grounds to myself. And I was wandering around, and over where the cathedral was, and according to many people, in the early evening, I guess during the time of Vespers, people would hear the monks still chanting their prayers kind of at sunset. And so I was kind of hoping to pick up on some of this, even though it was early morning when I was there. And as I was wandering around, where one of the walls of the cathedral had been, they had planted a row of trees. And they were only about 10 or 12 feet high at the time. They were very young trees. But I'm wandering around, taking pictures. In another haunting incident in the 1960s, I think it was, BBC was filming a documentary, and their cameraman had pointed his camera at an area where the high altar had stood, and taking pictures of the high altar would have been considered kind of sacrilegious, but the camera was yanked out of his hand. And so, being an American tourist, I, of course, started taking a whole bunch of pictures of the high altar because we're silly people. But as I was wandering around taking pictures, it had been a very chilly day, even though the sun was out. The air was chill, and I was wandering around. I noticed that all these trees, that was the border of the wall of the cathedral, all the branches were waving back and forth in this very heavy wind. And yet, I noticed I was actually surrounded by a very calm spot. There was no wind. As a matter of fact, even though it was chilled, the air was chill, there was still kind of this sensation of growing warmth. So here I'm only 15 feet away from the trees, and the branches are waving back and forth in a frenzy almost, and yet there I am in this pocket of stable air. And as I walked around taking pictures, that stability followed me the entire time.
So, do you think that this, it was obviously they were blowing around like there was a high wind blowing. Do you think that could have just been there, that you're saying that wherever you went, it was stable? Maybe that it was just that area that there was something paranormal going on?
It could be. Here's where we kind of report facts as we see them, and then interpret the facts. And I had people suggest that the monks were welcoming me, and so they had spiritually or however changed the physics around so that I was in like a warm embrace, and that they kept the cold wind. Other people, like you, just suggested, well, maybe for whatever reason the paranormal event was tied to the trees. I did not. With 20/20 hindsight now, I should have actually gone right up to the trees and seen whether or not the limbs stopped shaking and the wind went down when I went over to the trees.
Yeah, there was no trees in the distance that were blowing or anything.
I don't recall.
Yeah. That's strange. And as you've been saying this house used to belong to a deacon. And as you've been saying this, I've had my lights flicker twice in this room. And one of the things that does happen in this house is we hear chapel music sometimes. Chapel singing, hymns singing.
That would be interesting to hear.
Yeah,
Have
Brian, you speak to Brian next time. Ask him about the time he heard it.
Okay.
Have you ever been able to record them when it's happening?
No, it's usually very early in the morning. Normally we're in bed. It's something like 6 o'clock in the morning where the family would have been up and getting ready for, and it's always on a Sunday, so they would have been getting ready for chapel, I expect.
This also goes to what I'm asked all the time too. Why didn't you take better notes and things like that? And I jokingly tell people, when these incidents happen in real life, music in the background does not cue up to tell you.
That's it. You've never got anything at hand. You've never got a camera at hand or something like that, when these things happen.
Yeah, it's over, and then you're left asking, what just happened?
Yeah, well, it's part and parcel of living in this place, so we take no notice now. If I hear singing or anything going on in the house or talking in the house, I just turn over and go back to sleep. Totally ignore it. That's what it's like. You just live with it, and that's it. But Beulah Abbey, like you're saying, that must have been quite an experience for you. Have you had any more experiences over here in the UK? Have you done any investigating over here?
I've not done full-on investigations. I guess I have to admit I'm kind of a paranormal tourist. I do try and find haunted hotels and things like that. But what happened in the loo with the feet under the door and Beulah Abbey, those are probably two of the biggest, which is why they stick with me. Now that you've asked me any other experiences, I'm looking up at the ceiling trying to remember.
Well, I'll tell you what, we've got some beautiful old coaching inns over here. So if you ever get a chance to investigate any of them, definitely go and stay in a coaching inn, because they go back to some of them to the 16th century or earlier.
Yeah.
And you're definitely going to find a ghost in one of those. I found.
Yeah.
I love staying in old places. I really do. I don't like to stay in modern hotels. Not in this country, anyway.
Yeah. Why for a tourist like me, why go to England and then stay in a Motel 6? It does not make sense.
Well, it doesn't make sense. It might be a bit cheaper, but it doesn't make sense. Especially if you're coming over to experience old England as it was. You just don't want to be staying in somewhere modern.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do they even have Motel 6s over there? And if they do, that's really frightening.
No, they're not called Motel 6s. They've got Trust House 40s and places like that.
But do they leave the light on for you?
Why would they leave the light on?
I'm sorry.
She doesn't get it. She don't get it.
No, well, we don't have that advert over here.
Yeah, they hired a spokesman. His name was, if I could say the name, Tom Bodette, who had been a radio broadcaster. And for about 20 years, he just had this very, very soft kind of southern country accent.
Southern drawl, talking about Motel 6, clean, comfortable room. Come on, we'll leave the light on for you.
Yep, at an affordable price.
Yeah.
Don't forget that, too.
Yeah,
Some of those rooms skeeved me out, man. I tell you, when I was in the 80s, when I used to do a lot of traveling with no money, I used to stay in Motel 6s. But after a while, I've been in some like, oh, yeah, no, I wouldn't want to use a black light in here.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was the interesting thing when talking about travel for a paranormal researcher author in the U.S. as opposed to the U.K. The state of Washington is large, and when I used to the month of October's, and as well as December, do these kind of road trips to go to chain bookstores, Barnes and Noble and such. And yeah, then you're all about saving money and trying to maximize the profit and cut down on travel costs. And there's a mountain range that divides the United States in half, or excuse me, Washington State in half. It's the Cascades Mountains in the central, and the weather changes dramatically different east of the Cascades. And I had stopped at a rest stop. That was not improved. All it was some toilets, and that was about it. And parking lot. And
You've got a thing for toilets, haven't you?
What can I say? I was deployed to Afghanistan twice, and I really learned to appreciate flush plumbing after that.
Yeah.
But I was napping in my car, and then I woke up like 5 hours later, and I was absolutely alone in that parking lot. Every other vehicle was gone, and there was about 8 inches of snow on the ground. And that was kind of a lesson to me. Ever after, I would always stay at a motel somewhere, because I was driving a subcompact car too without chains. It was kind of scary.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, definitely. You know, it's scary driving a car down the valleys in Wales in snow, down the roads, let alone there.
Yeah, your roads are probably a lot narrower than our American roads too.
Yeah, we don't have to go. Well, no, I don't know. Our motorways are massive. They are massive. Our B roads are quite big. It's the little back country lanes and things like that are small. You know, and you always get these blooming great articulated lorries with their sat-navs being taken down these little country lanes and getting stuck.
Yeah, well, we have that too. Absolutely.
Do you? Oh, you do?
Yeah. So.
Okay, so you've had some quite... Have you ever had really a scary experience anywhere?
Yeah. Yeah, and we, guys, particularly, don't get me wrong. Now I'm just kind of old and chunky, and I've kind of gotten over some of the macho-ness. But in my younger days, probably the most interesting haunt that I was at was here at the Vancouver Barracks, and there was a hospital that was constructed about 1904. And Western medicine in 1904 is vastly different than it is now. And it had been abandoned as a hospital for many, many years. It had been converted into kind of a military schoolhouse. And so it was empty over the weekend. They loaned me the keys and said, have fun, just lock the building up, which was kind of cool for us.
Yeah.
And I went through with with my wife and my friend Brian, and we went through the building. And I'm not going to enlarge upon yet another haunted bathroom. That was kind of a side note to this one. But but that's why there should be a book called like Haunted Bathrooms of the World.
Yeah.
Now we were down in the basement. And this hospital, and in hospitals of that date, they put the morgues in the basement, usually at the north end, because that's the coolest spot. And I was not the first one to try a paranormal investigation there. This other woman had been in the basement, and as she told a reporter, she was chased out of the building by the forces of darkness itself.
Oh,
and so,
my
of course,
gosh.
that's where we wanted to
But I
sleep.
wasn't there. So how could that be?
Well, maybe you're not quite as dark as what chased her out of the basement.
Yeah, talk to some of my exes.
Yeah. As I tell people on my tours, my ex-wife didn't think I was funny either.
Yeah. So you stayed down there?
Yes, we did. And we actually did not last the night.
You didn't last the night?
No, this was my first investigation, so you should forgive me for whinging a little bit about it. But we were down there, and we were kind of lucky. Well, the morgue room, of course, there are no bodies in there. This is 50 years later, but they converted the morgue into a library, and it was locked, but we were as close as we could get to that morgue end. And during the Spanish flu epidemic, it came to the United States too, 1918, 1919. And the newspapers of the day talked about how the hospital there was so crowded that they were double stacking bodies in the morgue as well as on gurneys in the basement too. And so we were in this particular area, but there was a couch and a table as well as the hallway floor. And so I was sleeping on a couch, and on the opposite side of the hallway was my friend Brian, and my wife Janine felt a little safer. She was on the floor, but she said anything that wants to get to me has to go through you guys first. And it turned out she was right. About an hour into sleeping, I heard this kind of a metallic squeaking noise. I'm not sure how this is going to come across on audio, but it was just like like a seesaw, kind of back and forth.
Yeah.
And I rolled over and I looked at my friend Brian, and his eyes were huge, and he whispered to me, "Table's shaking. It's not me."
Oh.
And I was still asleep, and I whispered back, "Huh?" And he whispered louder, "It's not me." And he stiffened. I saw him on the table stiffening and sticking his arms out and legs out straight, and he was stiff as a board, and the table underneath him was shaking back and forth.
Yeah.
And stress being what it is, I just whispered, "Well, get off." That was the only thing I can think of. And so he rolled off the table, and we, that's when I tell people, that's when we said it's time to go home. And we packed up our stuff, and we left.
With that motion.
Sorry, Mark.
It's okay.
I was in a bed once when the bottom of the bed lifted right up in the air.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
so
didn't say. I just turned around and said those magic words and then went to sleep. But, I've been in some really horrific places where most people can't stand to be, and I've been okay. A morgue wouldn't worry me because dead people don't worry me.
Oh, yeah, it's the living that scare the crap out of me, especially in this day and age.
They're the dangerous ones, but, I've seen so many dead people, it really doesn't make much difference to me now.
Yeah, and half of them vote for the Democrats. Oh, anyway.
Done.
I was going to say, with that back and forth motion on the that he was feeling in the morgue, maybe it was a ghost of a necrophiliac.
Well, maybe. Or see, Brian had spent his entire time wandering around saying, "Yeah, Mr. Ghost, I challenge you. Do something. Show me you're here." That's when he got his final message, I think.
Okay, I can't say what I want to say there, but
Yeah, these days I might be a little more blasé about it, but again, the whole experience, we went in not really expecting too much, because I figured, you know what, you go to all these investigations and usually nothing happens, but the entire night it was a pretty active set of happenings. Now these days I would be like, all right, let me run toward it.
yeah, that's the whole thing. So many people, they think, oh my God, does it scare you? It's like, I haven't had any experiences yet that have really scared me. And I've been creeped out in places. Have you ever heard of Rolling Hills Asylum in New York?
Yes, I have.
Yeah,
yes.
I've been there a couple times, and that place is really wild. We've always had a lot of good experiences there. I've been there a couple of times. But yeah, I can hang out, go in a cemetery by myself in the middle of the night. Doesn't bother me. Or down in a basement by myself. Doesn't bother me, because I just really haven't had those types of experiences that scare me.
Yeah, well, cemeteries, and I warn people, at least here in the Northwest, I don't know about elsewhere, but I warn people, don't ghost hunt in a cemetery at night, because don't be afraid of the ghosts. Be afraid of the people who hang out there for other reasons.
Yeah, well, be that or the people, or in my neck of the woods in North Jersey, like the bears or the skunks. You know what? You're more than likely going to run across a skunk than you are a ghost, and it'll have a longer lasting impression.
In my area, we've had a couple of cases where a drug deal has gone bad, and people have been injured, shot, and killed in some of the region cemeteries. So that's really my concern.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
I'd rather have your bear.
Yeah, yeah. At least they'll usually run from you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and if you turn around, you can run the other way and double your distance.
Yep. There you go. So, Jeff, now you are also an author of several books, too.
Yeah. Over the years, I have written or contributed to over a dozen books, and probably 2/3 of them are on the paranormal. And I continue publishing. As a matter of fact, this year in June, I published a book called Vancouver, USA Ghosts, Volume 1, and is about my hometown.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. Again, Vancouver, you can trace it back as far as Western colonization to the 1820s, and this really was a rough town over the years, and it's really left its mark. Not just the military barracks. The town grew up around the barracks, the city itself and the barracks. In some cases, some of these crimes seem amazing in a way. You read them and think that it's some kind of a screenplay for a movie or something. There was one case where, and this is, I want to say, about 1905, where some off-duty soldiers were in a local bar, and I think they were playing jacks for money. And a young soldier wandered in, and his corporal was playing jacks. They played, the corporal won, and the private got angry, and they started an argument and said, why don't we just take this outside? And so the corporal said, sure, why not? And everybody watched them walk to the back of the bar and out into the back, and then 2 shots rang out, and a couple seconds later, both men walked in, very peaceful. And to me, it's starting to feel like a Clint Eastwood, Sergio Leone movie where they just both walk up to the bar. Neither of them have an expression on their faces. The corporal bellies up to the bar, puts his hand on the counter, and said, "I've been shot," and collapsed.
Wow.
And he died in the hospital, and it turned out that the private planned to do this. He'd gone to a hardware store and bought a pistol about an hour before. They found him guilty of murder, but years later, people forgot about that incident happening in that building. The building's still there. but they had always talked about this alleyway in back. People had gotten a weird vibe there, and people in the back of that part of the building too. It again, just this bad vibe, and some people claim that they'd seen some kind of a foggy mist. And I just did the historic research and came across that incident, that building, to kind of tie things together. I'm working on another volume already, and was it 1905? This woman walking down one street over from Main Street on our Broadway, I think it was. Somebody was on a horse with a stick, kind of driving a bull up the street. I don't know how often that happens happened in English streets in 1905, but it happened here. And the bull got out of control and gored this woman and stomped on her several times.
Oh. In
broad daylight in the city street, and she survived. In the newspaper account, the newspaper reporter was talking about it. It's really fortunate she was gored by a short-horned bull rather than a longhorn, because she would have surely been killed then.
Yeah.
And they didn't think that was a serious comment to make. But I'm sorry, I have to laugh myself at that. Not that I'm laughing at her, how tragic it was, but the odd things about reality.
So does this woman or this bull haunt this street? Does it reoccur, or?
That's not reoccurred, but that this is right opposite what we call what's named today Esther Short Park. It was the city park. It's like within the middle of the town, and the park itself is haunted in many ways. So this is the woman and her child were leaving the park, so it's right off the street. But just looking at this, for instance, somewhere in and around the park in this area, when it was still woods, one of the local settlers had a shootout with officials from the Hudson's Bay Company and killed 2 men there.
Yeah.
And so this park and the surrounding area just have this weird vibe, and trying to explain things that happen there. And so
it's like energy, tragedy, and energy just imprinted on the atmosphere.
I think so. I really do. And this actually ties in with one of the other TV shows I've been on is The Dead Files.
Oh yeah, I've heard them.
Yeah,
I've heard of them. Yeah.
And they had an episode there in the park, because there's the park itself is haunted, as well as this one house that was turned into a theater in there. So I let's face it, Irene and Mark, we can't prove to a skeptical audience that ghosts exist, but we can't prove they don't exist either.
No, that's true.
I just try and draw correlations between these incidents have happened as far as what people think is paranormal, and now let's go through the historic record and find parallels.
I see on your website also, which is, by the way, people, ghostsandcritters.com. And you can buy the books on there as well. But I see on there as well, you've got a thing called a section called Strange Critters, or was it something about critters? I can't remember what the actual title was. Let me just scroll up.
Strange Critters, yes.
Yeah, Strange Critters.
Yeah.
So what do you class as strange critters? Because...
As opposed to ordinary critters.
Yeah, well, a lot of things that I've seen and in various places, I would class as astral critters, like little black things like the size of a dog darting across the floor or something like that, But you're talking about strange critters.
Yeah. And this goes back to my anthropology background. When you get physical anthropologists and kind of paleontologists talking about Neanderthals and going backward in time, Australopithecus, they used to have a big dividing line about what was a man and what was not. And so they just started looking at various kinds of these hominid or human-related bones and started saying, well, this is a man, this is a critter.
Yeah.
And so critter is kind of an indefinite term. These are not ordinary animals. And so included in that, of course, here out in the Pacific Northwest is Sasquatch, is Bigfoot. And we have our own set of sea critters, too. Just like in Loch Ness and other places, they believe that, and some people believe that the dinosaurs have survived in certain areas. And so we have that. We have lake monsters.
Your lake monsters, yeah.
Yeah. And so even Bigfoot and things like that, we've had that in Europe for centuries as well. You've got the Willowoos in Scotland, the Tremor in Wales, which Mark was mentioning earlier on. When we first started the show, he was talking about this house and the Tremor and one thing or another. Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I try.
And churches and things, these grotesque figures and carvings on the churches, these pagan things like the Green Man, which is the man of the woods.
Yes. And I am fascinated with, like you mentioned, the Green Man and the Wild Hunt. I am fascinated the European sense. And that's kind of carried over here to the Northwest. In particular, I kind of mix in with that in my books. I usually have a section called this Native American spirits. And there are pioneer and Native Americans themselves have said this particular place was a sacred place to us. Vision quest sites where you find your totem, you find your guardian spirit, who oftentimes take animal form when they deal with humans.
Yeah.
And so I like visiting those kind of places and retelling some of those stories, and so I include that in my books when, depending on where the book is, what geographic spot the book is, I will look for these legends too, because regardless of our cultural origins, Native American, Euro American, Latin American, all of our cultural groups have legends, have stories that really tie us to the unknown, not in an H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu kind of way most of the time, but creation stories, guardian spirits, and things like that.
Yeah. It's just that in various parts of the country or various parts of the world, they come under different names, that's all. But they're basically the same thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it is interesting when you get historic records that verify, in my area, the Native American legends. So they're not just Native American legends, they're Native American facts. For instance, throughout the Pacific Northwest, Washington and Oregon state are divided for the most part by the Columbia River. And there are native stories that talk about these great floods that swept through and scoured the landscape. And some people in the 19th century tended to think, well, it was just the Christian missionaries convincing them of the creation myth. But indeed, they found, after the ice ages ended, a whole series of floods did scour out the Northwest. So geologists verified what the Native Americans already knew. And I do talk about that in my books when it's appropriate.
It's interesting. Don't you think so, Mark?
Yes. Well,
it's the sort of thing you like, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. This is right up my alley. Especially with growing up. I grew up in California, and we traveled up through Oregon and Washington, and I picked up John Green's Bigfoot books back in the 70s and learned all about, the Bigfoot and Sasquatch and all that, and I've been hooked ever since. Now, but there's also so many other great tales and legends. I mean, one of the legends that they talk about, we've had Jason Jarrell on the program talking about giants. And a lot of Native American stories about giants. Have you heard much about that?
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, more east of the Cascades, in the Cascade Mountains themselves, and east of the Cascades, they talked about giants, and this was some of the native folks still carrying on talking about them into the 1860s and 70s. Despite the white pioneers poo-pooing the idea, definitely they talked about giants usually living in the mountains or on the edges of the mountains, and they would come down off the mountains, and when it got cold, they would leave the mountains because it's too cold on the tips, and they would live on the edges of human habitation. And there was one story I remember. The high point of this was that in the middle of the night, this one long house, the fires got backed up and they almost suffocated, and that was because when they ran outside, they saw that a giant was looking through the smoke hole inside to see what everybody was doing.
That's
Wow.
now, but with the now here.
What's the smoke? Sorry. What's the smoke hole?
They didn't have a chimney. This was a Native American log house.
Oh, I see, like a little hole.
The hole for the
Yes.
smoke to escape from when they have fires inside. Now, how much? Now, there's two different types of phenomenon, I guess you want to call it, where you could talk about giants, and certainly Bigfoot or Sasquatch will fall into that category. But of course, they have their own very unique look, which is, hairy, almost ape man-like, still walking upright. But then some of the other stories of giants that they've talked about in Native American lore are actually, very human, white with red hair. Being 8 or 9 feet tall. And I don't know if you're familiar with Jason Jarrell, and his recently published book, Ages of the Giants, which talks about the Hopewell and Adena mounds in the Midwest, in Ohio, in the Ohio area.
Sorry, Mark, isn't that the book we edited?
Yes.
Well,
Yes, it was. Well, he went with another publisher, but I told him to because he needed to have that larger distribution. But
yeah.
they finding these giant skeletal remains. Even the Smithsonian had supposedly come in and picked up some of these remains. Of course, they're whisked away, never to be seen again. But the legend tells of very human but large red-headed giants. So with what you're hearing on these stories about seeing a giant looking in the smoke hole, do you have an understanding of what type we're talking about?
Your example is of course different than mine, because the giants that I'm talking about would have been 20 feet tall, because these houses were very tall. But I do know, and I have heard about the red-headed giant folk. This is stories about them somewhere from the Great Basin in Utah eastward, where they have found burials in caves. And yeah, they said that they had red hair because there's hair left with the skeletons. Not here in the Pacific Northwest, I don't think.
Well, I had heard a story about the Paiute Indians in Northern California supposedly had run-ins with these giants, and actually, I forget how old these stories go back to, but there was one point where they trapped a bunch of them in a cave and set fire to the front of the cave to smoke them out, but they died in the cave of asphyxiation. But these were very, very tall, red-headed, giant-type men that also were supposed to be very, very aggressive and cannibalistic.
I don't doubt that. And there's historic records that suggest that might tie into maritime accidents. There's a trade current that basically, if you're in Northern California, very southern Oregon, this current on the Pacific will go south towards Southern California, but it will then make a circle, and it will actually circle west toward Europe. And it actually makes this just big circle. It'll not Europe, I beg your pardon, Asia. So it'll touch down and come very close to the Philippines, and this current will continue north all the way to the Aleutians in this big circle. And there have been found in one set of archaeological deposits at least, predating Columbus, so this very early 1400s, some iron tools in Native American ruins. And they examined the iron at a molecular level and found it was related to Japanese metalwork. And there were some Spanish galleons that ended up wrecking ashore off the coast of Oregon, but they had come from the Philippines based on the cargo of beeswax. So definitely, as far as legends go and historic documents go, all the way from, like, I think the year 500 AD, people have claimed to have made these journeys from Asia to other lands. Some people think the west coast of the United States. Did I go too long on that one?
No, not at all.
There was a monk named Huey Sean, and this was, I think, in the 500s AD, and he was originally from Afghanistan, but he came to the Chinese court, and he went on a mission to exploration, and he supposedly landed in a place he called Fusang and explored an area of several hundred square miles. And some people think that's California or even Washington or Oregon.
That's fascinating.
Tall, red-headed people. Some of these Spaniards were tall and had dark hair and red hair, so I wouldn't be surprised if there is a historical precedent for that.
Well, also, again, this is where I have such a fascination with this.
They've been found all over the world, though, haven't they? Because in the UK, there are stories of giants.
Well, yeah, Jack found some when up the beanstalk. You know, that's a...
Oh, share up.
What's the legend where Finn McCool and one of these Irish giants was coming after him, and Finn McCool wrapped himself up in like a baby's blanket, and his wife said, "Oh, that's Finn McCool's son," and the Irish giant ran away?
Yeah? I don't know that one. But I believe you. But I don't know that one. Getting back to Bigfoot, and do you think Bigfoot is blood and bone?
Well, What's
your idea of Bigfoot?
Yeah, the historic records, and this is the nice thing about people coming into the Northwest in the early 1800s, when there's still native people living and walking around, and then living amongst them and hitting the landscape. There are stories from the 1830s or 40s. There's one story that a woman was abducted by one of the wild men of the forest. Yeah. And that she was screaming because it was taking her away, and the people at the fort chased it down, and it abandoned her and ran into the woods. So this is a sighting that dates 1830s, 1820s. I believe in the possibility that there is some hominid, that there is some very ancient holdover from some of our cousins. Gigantopithecus is a humanoid fossil critter now, but they were 8 or 9 feet tall, and they lived in Asia, on the coast of Asia. I believe that they could have been here. I worked for the Forest Service for a number of years as an archaeologist, and some of the folk who lived around and worked around us definitely believed and had claimed they had seen Bigfoot. I never have myself. The more people who go into the woods, I think the less likelihood that this is still within Bigfoot's range, because you just get too many hunters and hikers coming in, and if they are very reclusive creatures, they're going to retreat higher up in elevation, as well as probably heading towards Canada to get away from all of the urban dwellers who hit the woods in summer.
Well, getting back to Gigantopithecus, I have an issue with that because what have they ever found on Gigantopithecus? A jawbone.
The teeth and jaw, yes.
That's it. And yet this is where I have an issue a lot with these paleontologists and archaeologists who try to piece together an entire, being out of a jawbone, and they know nothing about it. And they talk about this great big ape. Well, okay, you have an ape-like jaw, but I think because we don't have anything else to go on, I think they jump to a lot of conclusions. I think science jumps to a lot more conclusions than they let on in terms of dating, in terms of history, or what a past prehistoric animal could have been like. In dealing with the subject of a Sasquatch, whether that's Gigantopithecus, I don't think so. I think we're dealing with something far more interesting than an undiscovered quote-unquote great ape. Because what other great apes do we know that consistently walk upright in the manner that Bigfoot does? And I'll always point to the Roger Patterson-Gimlin film, the Super 8 film that they shot back in the late 1960s, which is still to this day probably one of the clearest Bigfoot films, of a Bigfoot walking in full view of the camera, walking upright, walking away. You see the muscles under the hair. You can tell that this is not a suit in any way, because I always laugh. I think there was and I'm going to make fun of the Brits here, Irene. There was a UK documentary a few years ago where they were trying to claim it was a suit, and they had a guy dressed up in a suit to show the difference, and it was ridiculous. There was no comparison. So, again, I think there's something much more interesting going on in terms of this creature. Now, you also mentioned the 1800s tale of the woman almost being abducted. There's also, and John Green had originally mentioned this tale in one of his books, I think Hunt for the Sasquatch, about Albert Ostman up in Vancouver, British Columbia, who he was actually kidnapped and spent a few days in the company of a family of these creatures.
But Mark, there's an illness, isn't there? What's the name of that wrestler, that big wrestler?
Oh, Andre the Giant?
Yeah, there's an illness that can make them, or
hyperthyroidism.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
could that not have been the cause of maybe a lot of this many years ago?
Well, it depends. I mean, does hyperthyroidism also cover people head to toe with hair? And
yeah, but has anybody ever got okay, they say they've seen them. Could this be legend? Has anybody actually got up close and actually seen one, got a photograph of one beside that Roger Patterson film, which could be true or may not be true. We don't know.
Well, I guess that all depends on your opinion, because there's so many people who have had up close personal encounters with seeing Bigfoot. Our friend Tim Stover, who we've had on past shows, out of Ohio. He was deer hunting in a tree stand 20 years ago, and one morning, and he happened to look over, and there was one standing 40 feet from him. And he was up.
There is also a condition where people can get covered in hair.
True, but you think somebody covered in hair is going to be out living in the woods like an animal?
Well, there was one in Russia, wasn't there? That young boy.
True.
He was ostracized by his religion, one thing or another, and took to the woods.
Well, but he's still human. That doesn't explain all of the sightings, not only throughout the North American continent.
I'm not saying that they don't exist, but I still cannot understand why they haven't found any real evidence.
Well, then that
unless, like we've talked before, they're dimensional.
Well, let me ask Jeff his opinion, because based on his background, there's a lot of people who tell stories and a lot of researchers who believe that these types of creatures And some of these other types of quote-unquote cryptid-type creatures are more interdimensional than they are in our reality. And what are your thoughts on that?
I wouldn't be able to. I actually don't have an opinion about them being interdimensional at all. I might just say, sure, why not? Because, again, we can't prove or disprove. And I do believe in multiple dimensions. I'll go along with physicists on that. As far as let's face it, not to use the bad metaphor, the smoking gun would be an actual real hair sample, or a body, or most of a body, would prove whether or not Bigfoot exists or not. So far, it is mostly literature. There was an anthropologist who's now passed on. His name is Grover Krantz. I don't know if he's mentioned in your bookmark.
I don't have a book. Oh, in this.
No, I'm the writer.
No, I've heard of Grover Krantz. I've heard of him.
Yeah. Now, Grover Krantz worked at Washington State University, which has had a long tradition of turning out really good anthropologists and archaeologists, and he actually wrote a book called "The Scientist Looks at Bigfoot." And he talked about the number of fakes, and that's the bad part. Just like you talk about TV shows and like someone who owns a pub that wants to increase their business, so they claim it's haunted.
So they put out all these fakes, and it ruins the subject.
Exactly. And Grover Krantz actually looked at what he called dermal ridges, what you and I would call finger and footprints. And so when he was looking at casts that supposedly came from Bigfoot, do they have the whorls like a fingerprint and handprint, or are they smooth? And so that was he wrote a series of articles on determining what were fakes and what weren't. Yeah. And he believed that they existed, that the possibility of Bigfoot existing was out there, but he just would have taken a lot of convincing.
Yeah. I think something exists. Something must exist, because this goes back in legends for hundreds of years, and legends have to start somewhere, don't they?
Absolutely.
Well, the Native Americans have had their legends of Bigfoot going back for many, many years. And again, it's not only just in the Pacific Northwest. It's on pretty much almost every continent has had reports of Bigfoot. From North America, South America, Asia, Europe, even there in the UK, you have people who have cited the Trey Moore.
Yeah.
And you've heard the screams coming from the hills from your valley.
Well, yeah, I've heard something. Definitely heard something. But, in this day and age where we're said to be able to get to the moon and one thing or another, and we can't get something on this being. We can't get something at all on this being, yet we've moved so far in technology and everything. But it eludes us.
Not exactly. Well, I mean, it eludes us in the fact that we still haven't gotten a body dragged out in front of all the cameras.
Haven't even got a poo sample.
Yes, they have. They've had scat samples. They've had hair samples, whenever.
But what do they say when they go off?
Usually, they come back as undetermined. It's undetermined. Well, that's because it's an undetermined species. It doesn't come back as anything. It may have human qualities or hominid qualities, but it comes back as undetermined. Dr. Melba Ketchum, who had infamously, depending on your point of view, had gotten a hold of hair samples and had them tested. But you know what? The problem is, she was also vilified and ridiculed and put down. They wouldn't revere it in peer reviews. And anytime these things come up, the skeptics are so quick to jump on it that it never really goes anywhere. And I've seen several programs. I mean, heck, even Josh Gates with Destination Truth. When they found the one Yeti, well, where was when they went after the Yeti and they found the track and they had hair samples and they had it tested and whatnot, and he got casts of the footprint, and yet it still makes barely a blip on the news because it's never going to be enough. And
I can't poo-poo it. Excuse the pun. I know we've been talking about loos and everything today, but I can't poo-poo it. because of what I've experienced in this house. These things but I think that it is more interdimensional. What I am seeing and what I've experienced out there, outside my back door, these things, they back up and they just disappear.
Well, and that's the question. And you mentioned it earlier, is that what you're really dealing with? You are not sure. What you saw...
I'm not sure whether it's some sort of alien being. But, it's not as if I drink or anything like that, so I'm not hallucinating.
What, you weren't having Prosecco?
Being, but it has the outline like Predator, this bloomin' big thing that's shimmering, but it's not Predator.
Are you sure you weren't drinking Prosecco in the garden?
Sorry?
Are you sure you weren't drinking Prosecco in the garden?
No. No. No.
Well, there's a question for you, Jeff. There's a question for you, Jeff. Have you ever seen a type of cryptid creature that you couldn't explain that's not necessarily ghost related?
Was that before or after the first bottle of Prosecco?
I only drink Prosecco when I'm in Italy.
Okay.
Make my own wine here, but I don't drink that either.
I've not seen a critter that I couldn't explain, and I'm going to pretend that I'm the character Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. On one hand this, and on the other hand that. I worked for years as a field archaeologist for the Forest Service, going into areas where there was virgin timber and surveying for archaeology and clearing it for cutting. So I went into a lot of areas where there were no roads, and the only one human who would have been there would have been Native American and modern hunters, and sometimes not even them. And I never saw anything like that. I live on the edges of woods right now, and every now and then, a couple times a year, I see a bear walking across my front yard. And either a bobcat or a cougar, a tall bobcat, have actually left deep claw marks on my garbage cans. So I'm at the edges of what some people call wilderness. Never seen it, but I still, on the other hand, I have to say that's just me. And an elusive critter or cryptid of any kind, whether it be corporeal, in living form like Gigantopithecus Bigfoot, I could be missing it. And especially if it's extra dimensional, which I don't sneer at, sure, why not? Because there are things out there we don't understand. That's why they call them paranormal. But I haven't seen that either. I want to.
That's it. I've been investigating the paranormal for over 18 years, and to this day, I've yet to see a ghost.
Well, I think a hell of a lot of it is wherever your state of mind is at the time, whether you're picking things up, seeing things. And I don't mean with Prosecco, sweetie. It's a lot of the stuff that goes on in this house. You're kind of like in a daydream at the time, and then suddenly you realize that somebody's talking behind you or something like that. There's voices. But, too busy, you're in some sort of other world at the time it starts to happen. And then you think, you realize you hear it and you think, oh, shit, there's someone talking. You're suddenly coming out of that daydream state that you're in.
Yes, the music does not warn you. Yeah.
Yeah. It's mind you, even when I've been walking around the house and I've seen one on the stairs or something like that, I'm kind of thinking about what I'm got to do next. I'm not thinking about it. Whenever you try to, let me explain if I can, walla. If I go into a room and think to myself before I go in there, right, I'm going into that room and I'm going to have a look for that ghost in that bloody room. It's not going to happen. But if I go into that room thinking, I must empty the washing machine in a minute, there it is. Am I waffling?
No. I was just thinking about one time how I missed getting my own TV show, and you both been in the business and doing this, being out there more than me, but for people who've not been anywhere on the inside, usually it starts off with an email from some producer type, and then you trade a couple emails, then they call you up on the phone and chat, and then you go through a series of Skype video chats where they kind of size you up and how you look. And I made it all the way through, like, I think the second Skype call from this producer type, and we were just ending up, and I could see her smiling at me and nodding, and I said, hey, how about this for a show concept? We ghost hunt during the day with the lights on.
Oh, do you know something? You're talking about that. I had to do a tourist film for Wales, and we'd done it during the day in bright sunshine. Went down there, and it was all to do with ghosts and spooky happenings in Wales. The amount of evidence we got was unbelievable. You know, you don't have to do these things at night because they're around you all the time. You know, things happen all the time. It's just you're more aware of them at night because you're a bit more on the edge. That's all.
Yeah, I agree.
But you're talking about shows as well. You know, any producers out there that want a bloody show that's going to knock the socks off of any other show out there, contact info@Paranormal UK Radio.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have the concepts. We just need the funding and connections.
Yeah.
Well, and since you're in Wales, I was actually thinking about a joke. You know, as seen on that one Doctor Who episode in the where they're in was it a funeral parlor or a church? This is about 10 years ago.
Oh, the one with the cemetery.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the cemetery. That particular day I'd done that tourist thing for Wales. I went to that cemetery, and I picked up a woman saying, and it was an AVP. I don't know whether you know the difference between an AVP and an EVP. Electronic voice phenomena, where you pick it up on machines. AVP was when it's audible and you actually hear it with your own ears. And I heard this woman say, look for the rose. And we were on a footpath beside the actual cemetery. I think it's Box Cemetery at the time in Llanelli. And we were on this footpath. Anyway, we went back and we went into the cemetery and everything. And we're walking along through the graves and one thing or another. And all of a sudden, I saw a little plastic flower, which was a red carnation, stuck in the ground, not in a vase, stuck into the earth at the head of this headstone, by this headstone. And I heard the word Mary. And when I looked at the headstone, it was Mary.
Interesting. At times like this, when somebody comes up to me in an event and they tell me stories like this, I look at them and say, you are so lucky.
Oh, not really. It's boring. What were you saying about the Doctor? Because Doctor Who was filmed there at that cemetery in Wales.
Because BBC doesn't always make it. All the shows don't make it to the U.S., at least the West Coast. There was one episode where they show up the TARDIS shows up in 19th century Wales, and it's either in a funeral home or some kind of a rectory, and these extra dimensional beings are surviving through the gas jets, through the gas jet lights. And when somebody dies for a brief time, they can actually occupy the corpse and reanimate it. And that was reminding me somewhat of what you're talking about extra dimensionality. Yeah.
So it's a similar thing to walk-ins or jump-ins, as we call them.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, that sounds like the plot of Night of the Living Dead.
Or The Walking Dead. Have you got your baseball bat covered with barbed wire?
Yes. Named Lucille.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I have to laugh.
I don't watch that. I don't like zombies. I don't like the makeup.
Yeah, they're a little overdone over here.
Yeah. But there's so many strange things out there, especially in the UK and Europe. What about Afghanistan? Did you see anything out in Afghanistan? Any strange things happen to you out there?
Oddly, yes. Now that you asked.
Yes, I'm glad I asked.
I was there strictly as military historian, and I fell in on a certain group of soldiers, the certain set of units, kind of like they divided the pie, and my slice of pie included space within Bagram Air Base. There was the larger base was subdivided into sections, and one of the sections was called Camp Vance. And this portion had been constructed by the Soviets after they invaded in the 1970s and 80s, and it included part of an underground bunker. And you went down a set of concrete steps, and there were several rooms down there. And we were not using them as any kind of suspicious bunker. It was offices, believe it or not, because it was dry and it was kind of a controlled space. And I had an office down there, and what they did basically was this larger bunker, which was all concrete. They got sheets of plywood and some 2x4 studs, and just created sub offices. And one of the guys who was a communications specialist ended up living down in that space so that he could be closer to the radio equipment and the communications equipment. And he, at one point, we were talking, and he said, Major Davis, this is kind of odd, but here in this space that's where we bunk, I never sleep right. I don't know what it is, but I just keep on having nightmares, and I don't remember the nightmares in the morning. And I went into his space, and I said, I don't know whether this is subconscious or not, but look at the wall. And it was a blank concrete wall, but there were several stains, discolored stains. They were kind of circular. And based on based on some experience, this is a physics fact. You have concrete that's not sealed. If you drop something like blood on it, which has iron and copper oxides, it will interact with the concrete. And so I said, that looks to me like somebody had a shootout here, and these are all bullet blows, so that the bullet went through somebody, small hole in front, big hole in back, and it's just blood splatter. Yeah. And so I said, somebody had a shootout here, from what it looks like to me. Don't know when, but that's what happened. Now, it could be subliminal on your part, or there could be something left, some kind of a remnant. And so he immediately got some blue paint and painted all the walls in that space blue. And he said he didn't have trouble sleeping after that.
Amazing.
Yeah. Again, subliminal or paranormal or both.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Strange. It is, isn't it?
Yeah, and it, especially now that in itself could be an interesting book if you deal with paranormal encounters in war zone.
Yes.
That would be something that I think, you talk to enough vets who've been stationed places, and because I know there are a lot of people who've talked about haunted air bases. I mean, heck, even the barracks that you talk about there, the historical barracks, for some reason, military locations seem to attract a lot of paranormal activity.
Yeah. Well, it's a lonely lifestyle. That's for sure.
How long were you in the service for?
I had a mix of active duty and reserve service, but it was 32 years.
Oh, wow. Long time.
Good. Yeah, I'm old.
Yeah, welcome to the club.
Yeah, well, if you're old, you certainly don't look it.
Well, thank you, ma'am. I owe it all to a deal I made. The guy's name was Faust.
Oh, dear. Yeah, I got his ring.
I was just listening to I think it was an older BBC radio of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Oh, yeah.
The other day.
Yeah, can you imagine that? Huh?
I sold my soul to the devil.
I remember watching that film years and years ago.
Yeah.
I sold my soul to the devil, and all I got was this lousy T-shirt.
Not the only one.
Well, like I say, I've got his ring locked up in the safe, and that's where it's staying.
Yep, the demon ring. Well, it's actually not the devil's ring. We're not certain. We're not certain who it is.
Is that it's a few hundred years old.
Mm-hmm. Very old. And where's that ring going to eventually wind up?
You're getting it in my will.
Oh, geez.
It's sent over to you in a lead-lined box.
Oh, boy. Yeah, Sherry's going to love that.
I have when I meet up with people who tell me they're clairvoyant, and I believe in clairvoyance, but I don't believe anybody's clairvoyant 100% of the time, because if they were, they'd be insane.
Oh yeah, no, you've got to be grounded,
Yeah,
it's like a job. You switch it on when you want it, and you switch it off when you don't want it.
Yeah.
And sometimes you forget to switch it off, and it does your brain in.
Yeah. And one of the training / tests that I do for some is psychometry. Take an object and tell me about it.
That's right. Yeah, I remember I was teaching somebody once psychometry, and I gave her a piece of lava from Vesuvius.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing she came out with, 100%. She saw people running. She saw this stuff raining down on them. She had no idea. It just looked like any other piece of, it looked like to me lava, but it could have looked, for her, it just looked like a stone with little bits in.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Psychometry, I never really done psychometry. Although I can do psychometry, but I used to use it as a test on people as well.
Yeah, and what I did was I have to say this legally. I purchased a small copper ring or bronze ring, and it was Roman period, Roman Britain, and it was had a sunburst on it. Stylized sunburst, and other than myself, the person who dug it up, the last person to touch it was the owner.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't tell them about the ring at all, and it would just tell me everything you can about it. And in some cases, it was an amazing, just like you're talking about the Vesuvius stone, it can be sometimes amazing, the imagery that they get.
Yeah, yeah. Have you ever tried just looking at something and using it with a? I know psychometry is the science of holding an object, but have you ever tried it just by looking at an object, like a picture?
I have. I myself have tried, and usually is kind of an abysmal failure. Like I fall asleep.
Oh.
So,
well, unfortunately, we are actually running out of time. This show has gone by way too quick. So, before we go, can you just tell people a little bit, Jeff, on where they can find you, your website, and where they can get your books?
Sure, and I thank you. My website is www.ghostsandcritters, that's one word, ghostsandcritters.com, and look at the buttons on the left, and there you'll see book orders. You'll see appearances for when I'm doing things here in the Northwest and elsewhere. And I've maintained the website for over 20 years, so I've got over 150 pages of content to search through too.
Fantastic. Well, Jeff, thank you again for coming on the show. This has been a lot of fun talking to you tonight, and we'll have to have you back on again sometime.
Yeah, anytime you want. I have had a tremendously fun time.
Yeah, Jeff, don't go away.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio. You can Catch us every Wednesday night at 10 p.m. Greenwich Mean and Eastern Time. And where can people hear us, Irene?
Everywhere, people, everywhere.
Okay. All right. Thanks again, everybody.
And if you've got Alexa, tune in on Alexa, because it's absolutely brilliant.
Oh, there you go.
Paranormal UK Radio on TuneIn and Alexa.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again. And Irene, have a great week, and we'll catch everybody next week. Have a good one.
Okay, then. Bye.